Just in the last hour or so, we found out that both sides, the prosecution and the defense, had used their 6 peremptory strikes. So basically the 12 jurors that are in that box right now, that's basically going to be the jury. 9 women, 3 men. And now in the afternoon, after the lunch break, which we're on right now, they will go through the work of selecting the 6 alternates for this case. And each side will get 2 strikes to strike potential alternate jurors. So it appears at this point, at least, that the jury is pretty much set. We'll see what happens after the lunch break. A number of jurors were dismissed for cause, as they say, and some were stricken using those strikes. So that's where things stand right now. As we've been telling you, after the jury is seated and sworn in, they will be taken to the 4 crime scenes in this case. They will also be taken to the Wagner family's Flying W farm. That is the sprawling horse farm owned by Jake and George's grandmother, Frederica. Also, they'll be taken to the former home of Jake and George Wagner and Angela Wagner, where they were living at the time that these homicides were committed. So that's what's been going on out here so far today. A lot of questions posed to the jury by George Wagner's attorneys about how do you feel about homeschooling, or do you think that being involved in extracurriculars and other activities with other children is important to somebody's development? And that is important because Jake and George Wagner were homeschooled, okay? So they weren't really around other kids. So I think that's going to be something we'll see during the trial. I think his defense is going to argue that George was somehow, and Jake, they lived this insular lifestyle with their family, and that they weren't around other people. And so that maybe impacted them and their upbringing and their social, emotional development. So there's been some little cues and some little kind of like beads dropped along the way that give us a clue of where they're going with this case.
And we're glad you're there to decode those questions, because oftentimes those questions can fly under the radar. You don't really know where they're going with them, but those were clear signals, it seems, of what we're going to hear from the defense. Now, how likely do you think, once the trial gets going, that we're even going to get to a life or death penalty phase? Do you think that the deal that was struck with Jake and the mother will lead to taking the death penalty off the table for George and Billy?
Well, keep in mind that Jake has to testify to the satisfaction of the prosecution. He has to basically hold up his end of the bargain for the death penalty to be taken off the table, not only for himself, but all 3 of his other family members, Angela, Billy, and George. So Jake has not only this trial to testify in and take the stand in, but he has to take the stand also in Billy's trial. So I think that there's really not a definitive answer on how they're going to work this whole thing out, because it always appeared to us, from listening to how this deal was made from the time that Jake pleaded guilty back in April of 2021, that he had to testify in all of the trials. And then Angela pleaded guilty, of course, so that was one other trial he didn't have to testify in. But I think it's a strange thing. So I think we are going to still probably go through that sentencing phase of this trial should the jury find George Wagner IV guilty. They may find him not guilty, we just don't know. But they're still going to probably have to go through that, because we still have to go to Billy's trial. So they're probably going to follow through with this, and then they'll have to figure out, if Jake holds up his end of the bargain to the satisfaction of the prosecution, how they're then going to kind of, I guess, convert or make that death sentence go away.
Can you imagine at least being the defendant and trying to give everything to the satisfaction of the prosecution, and the prosecution perhaps then says, nope, still not good enough for us, we're going to go for the death penalty for your brother? I mean, that would be a wild situation, but as you said before, as we were talking, this is quite a saga. Now, as the saga begins, at least in the trial phase of this, are we expected to see still opening arguments quite soon? And then, if so, any insight into key witnesses or evidence that we may see once the trial gets moving forward?
Well, opening statements are set for the Tuesday after Labor Day, September 6th. So that will happen then. And then, it's my impression, just from looking at the subpoenas in this case, that they're going to start from the very beginning. And of course, this whole case started in the early morning hours, sometime between 7 and 8 a.m. on April 22nd, 2016, when Dana Roden, one of the victims in this case, her sister, Bobby Jo Manley, went to Christopher Roden Sr.'s home. She would go there every morning to feed his dogs, his chickens. I think there was even a hog or a pig there too. So she would go there to feed these animals. She unlocks the door, she opens the door, and blood is everywhere, she said. So she called 911, and that's how this case really began. That's how the bodies were discovered. Her brother, James, who goes by George, he discovered the other bodies on Union Hill Road in the other two trailers. So I think that those will probably be the first witnesses that we hear from, because if you talk about the chronology here, that's when it begins. So probably Bobby Joe and James George Manley, and then possibly George's wife April, because she was there as well that morning when the discoveries were made. So I think that's how it will start, kind of just laying out the case. This is how it began. There's a 911 call that's very upsetting that Bobby Joe placed when she found the bodies, and then they'll go from there.
And before then, we are going to have, as you said, a site visit for the jury to check out the farm and see the scene of the crimes. How do you think that's going to play with the jury as they go on that field trip of sorts?
Well, I think, Mike, it could be very helpful to them, because we have 4 crime scenes, 3 on one road. The 3 trailers were on Union Hill Road. And then Kenneth Roden, who was the last victim to be found that day, it was sometime in the afternoon. His cousin went looking for him because he had seen everything on the news, couldn't reach Kenneth. He went to his camper and found him several miles away. So I think this will assist the jury in really understanding the size and the breadth and the depth of this investigation. This is the largest criminal investigation in Ohio's history. It took investigators not only from Ohio, but to Montana and Alaska, to the border with Canada. So there was a lot of traveling involved in this case, because the Wagners eventually moved to Alaska. And so this was a big case, a lot of resources devoted to it. You had federal officials, federal law enforcement involved in this case. So, and there are a lot of properties that were searched many, many times during this investigation. So I think really seeing these locations and the farms, because there's more than one farm involved here, will assist the jury in seeing just how finding some of this evidence would have been like finding a needle in a haystack. And they found some of it. And Jake Wagner actually led them to the murder weapons and the truck that the family purchased to carry out the murders.